Most people think of the time of Jesus as a spiritual setting, sandals, sermons, miracles, morality plays in a distant religious past. But for the people actually living their daily life was not defined by theology, it was defined by money, or more precisely, by the lack of it. The world where the historical figure of Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. Welcome to the Financial Historian, on where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea sat inside the Roman Empire, the most sophisticated extraction machine the world had seen. Rome didn't conquer territories to integrate them, it conquered them to fund the center. Provinces existed to move wealth outward, grain, silver, labor, flowing from the edges of the empire toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those edges. This mattered because Judea was not wealthy. It was largely rural, agricultural, and fragile. Most people lived off the land, not farms in the modern sense, plots just large enough to survive. A bad harvest didn't mean lower profits, it meant hunger, and Rome didn't care. Rome governed Judea through a mix of local elites and imperial officials. Kings like Herod the Great ruled with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefects like Pontius Pilate oversaw the region. Their job wasn't to improve living standards, it was to keep order and ensure revenue kept flowing. Taxes were the system's backbone, and this is where things get uncomfortable. People today think of taxes as something paid on income, profit, growth. In Judea, taxes were owed regardless of outcome. You paid because you existed. Land tax, produce tax, head tax, toll taxes on roads and markets, religious taxes layered on top of imperial ones. Miss a payment and the consequences were immediate. There was no IRS, there was no appeals process. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers who paid Rome up front for the right to collect, and then squeezed the population to recover their costs and make a profit. Abuse wasn't a flaw, it was the incentive. If you couldn't pay, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere, and unlike modern debt, it had no safety valves, no bankruptcy, no restructuring. Interest accumulated fast. Land was collateral. One bad year could push a family into a spiral they would never escape. Here's how it usually worked. A farmer plants crops, weather turns, harvest fails, taxes are still due. The farmer borrows from a local lender, often a wealthy landowner or temple-connected elite. Interest accrues. Next year, yields barely recover. Debt remains. Eventually, the land is seized. The farmer becomes a tenant on what used to be his own property, or worse, a laborer, or disappears entirely. This wasn't an accident, it was structural. Over time, land consolidated into fewer hands. Larger estates replaced small plots. Wealth clustered around elites tied to Roman authority and temple administration. The majority sank into precarity. The economy didn't just produce poverty, it reproduced it. And there was no state safety net if you lost your land. There was no unemployment support, no welfare, no public housing. Families were the only buffer. Community charity existed, but it was limited. When too many people fell at once, the system offered nothing. Debt wasn't just financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, losing security, losing identity. Your family's future could be wiped out by a drought, a tax increase, or a single unpaid obligation. This is the world Jesus was born into, and it's important to say this clearly. Most people were not poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus, local elites needed rents, the temple needed revenue. All of that pressure sat on people with the least margin for error. This produced something else as well, tension. Judea was not quiet, it was volatile. Rebellions flared constantly. Banditry wasn't just crime, it was economic desperation. Groups formed promising relief, justice, reversal. Messianic movements didn't emerge in comfort, they emerged in collapse. And this is where modern viewers often miss the point. When people listen to sermons about debt forgiveness, release, justice, and reversal, they weren't hearing metaphors, they were hearing economic survival. When they heard talk of the poor, it wasn't abstract compassion, it was their neighbors, their families, themselves. And words like forgiveness in this context didn't just mean emotional relief, they meant debt cancellation, reset, escape. And escape was rare. The Roman system was designed to be efficient, not humane. It extracted wealth upward with a remarkable consistency. It tolerated suffering as long as order was maintained. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. This is why Judea felt suffocating. People worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity didn't translate into security. Growth didn't lift all boats. It lifted a few and sank the
rest. The economy functioned, but it didn't heal. And importantly, everyone knew it. There was no illusion that the system was fair. There was no belief that hard work guaranteed safety. There was only endurance and resentment, and hope that something, anything, might break the cycle. That hope is where ideas become dangerous. Because when a system is this tight, even small changes feel revolutionary. Even words can destabilize it, especially words. By the time Jesus begins speaking publicly, the economic pressure is already unbearable. The audience is primed, the fractures are visible, the anger is real, the desperation is rational. This is not a backdrop. This is the engine. To understand why the economic of Judea felt so inescapable, you have to look at the institution everyone believed was supposed to protect them, the temple. Most people today imagine the temple in Jerusalem as purely religious, a place of prayer, sacrifice, and spiritual authority. But in economic terms, the temple was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It didn't just shape belief, it moved money, a lot of money. The temple sat at the center of a layered system. On one level, it was sacred. It was where people believed God's presence resided. On another level, it functioned as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court. And these roles were inseparable. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay a yearly temple tax. This wasn't optional. It wasn't symbolic. It was enforced. The tax was paid in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, because it had a consistent silver content. Local currencies weren't accepted. Roman coins weren't accepted. That meant people had to exchange money to pay their religious obligation. Money changers handled this. They didn't do it for free. Exchange fees were built into the system. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for festivals needed to convert their currency. Vendors sold animals for sacrifice, doves, lambs, cattle, at temple-approved prices. If you were poor, you didn't escape the system. You paid in smaller offerings, but you still paid. Religion wasn't replacing the Roman tax burden. It was stacked on top of it. And here's the key tension. The temple elite were deeply intertwined with Roman authority. High priests weren't chosen by popular support or spiritual merit. They were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. So the institution that claimed moral authority over the people also benefited from the same extraction logic that impoverished them. This created a quiet contradiction. The temple preached holiness, forgiveness, and righteousness, but its operations reinforced bet, inequality, and exclusion. Access to God required payment. Purity required offerings. Forgiveness required sacrifice, and sacrifice required money. If you had none, you relied on charity, but charity was inconsistent. It couldn't absorb systemic pressure. It couldn't undo land loss. It couldn't cancel debts. It treated symptoms, not causes, and people noticed. By the 1st century, resentment toward temple authorities was widespread, not because people rejected faith, but because they saw hypocrisy. The institution meant to mediate between God and the people looked increasingly like another arm of elite control. This matters because Jesus didn't operate outside the system. He spoke directly into it. When he talked about debt forgiveness, people understood it economically. When he talked about release, they heard relief. When he talked about the poor, they didn't imagine distant charity cases. They imagined themselves. And when he talked about the kingdom of God, they didn't hear abstraction. They heard an alternative order, one where the current system wasn't final. That's why his words carried weight. But words alone don't threaten power structures. Behavior does. Jesus didn't attack Rome directly. That would have ended quickly. Instead, he undermined legitimacy. He reframed value. He challenged who deserved authority and why. He spoke in ways that weakened the moral foundation of both Roman extraction and temple complicity. This is why economic language appears everywhere in the teachings. Debt, wages, laborers, vineyards, creditors, stewards, masters, servants. These weren't metaphors chosen at random. They reflected daily life. They made inequality visible. And then there was the act that changed everything, the disruption in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it wasn't just religious outrage, it was economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer, he was attacking the machinery that monetized access to the sacred. He called it a den of robbers, not because money existed, but because extraction had replaced justice. This crossed the line. Rome tolerated prophets, it tolerated teachers, it even tolerated critics. What it didn't tolerate was instability, and temple authorities knew that unrest near Passover, when Jerusalem filled with pilgrims, was dangerous. Crowds plus grievance equaled rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus wasn't
Just preaching. He was disrupting flows. He was challenging legitimacy. He was destabilizing the balance that kept them in power and kept Rome satisfied. And that's the crucial point. The conflict wasn't primarily theological. It was economic and political. The system could tolerate suffering. It could tolerate inequality. What it couldn't tolerate was a narrative that made people question why the suffering existed and whether it was necessary. Because once people stop accepting debt as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. By this point, Judea was a pressure cooker. Taxes, land loss, debt, religious obligation, and political repression all converged. Revolt was not a question of if, but when. And Rome responded to pressure the same way it always did. What followed after Jesus wasn't the collapse of the system, it was the escalation of it. Within a generation, Judea erupted into full-scale revolt. In the year 66, open rebellion against Rome broke out. By 70, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the economic, religious, and political center of Jewish life, was destroyed stone by stone. Its treasury was looted, its priestly hierarchy erased. Hundreds of thousands were killed or displaced.
Rome didn't just suppress dissent, it dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible, and then it rebuilt control on its own terms. This is the part people often miss. The destruction of the temple didn't end economic extraction, it streamlined it. Roman taxation intensified, land consolidation accelerated. Debt didn't disappear, it became less visible, more bureaucratic, more absolute. The old moral language collapsed, but the material pressure remained. In the short term, Rome won decisively, violently, and efficiently. But winning control of territory is not the same as winning control of meaning. Jesus had not been leading an army. He hadn't promised a new tax policy or redistribution of land. He wasn't trying to replace Roman administration with a rival state. And that is precisely why his impact can't be measured by regime change. What he challenged wasn't Rome's ability to extract, it was the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable, deserved, and divinely sanctioned. By undermining the idea that debt reflected moral failure, by offering forgiveness outside institutional payment, by treating the poor as central rather than defective, Jesus destabilized something Rome depended on just as much as legions: legitimacy. Empires can survive suffering. They struggle when people stop believing suffering is the price of order. After the temple fell, the system Jesus criticized did not vanish, but neither did his critique. In the decades that followed, small communities formed that operated on different assumptions: shared resources, mutual aid, debt relief within the group, loyalty based on belief rather than land, bloodline, or status. These weren't revolutions, they were parallel logics, ways of living inside the empire without fully belonging to its moral economy. Rome crushed armed rebellion quickly, it always did, but this kind of challenge was harder to extinguish because it didn't require territory, temples, or treasuries. It moved with people, it worked under pressure, it survived loss. And over time, something unexpected happened. Rome never fully recovered control of the story. People told themselves about power, debt, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire didn't eliminate this alternative moral framework, it absorbed it. In doing so, it quietly conceded something profound. Authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered, even to power. The economy of Jesus' time shows us something uncomfortable. Systems don't collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the narratives that justify them stop working. Rome optimized extraction, but it never fully repaired the moral breach that made its dominance feel natural. And that's the deeper lesson. Economic systems wrapped in moral language are extremely durable. They survive hardship, they survive resentment, they even survive rebellion. What they don't survive is widespread disbelief. The moment when people stop accepting that suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful. History doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how power defends itself, not just with force, but with stories, it becomes much harder to believe those stories are accidental. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.